Hello and welcome. Just going to give it another 30 seconds or so, and then we will get started. So I got a few attendees trickling in, but we'll get the ball rolling. My name's Tal Kitron with Appleroot Tutoring Services. I work as a premium tutor, teaching mostly SAT, PSAT, ACT, and LSAT, as well as an executive function coach. And I've been with the company for about 10 years now. You should notice as you come in that closed captioning is enabled. You can also click out of that. And my goal is to leave some time for questions. I'll have you out of here within an hour. So put them in the Q&A and I'll get to those at the end. And today we're going to be talking about the ACT, so a test that has not changed nearly as much as the SAT recently. And our itinerary today is we're going to talk format of the test, so the 4 sections, the timing, the structure. We'll look at the content and some test taking tips and strategies for each section, because I know people always like those. And then just talk briefly about how does that fit into college application timeline and talk about scoring and just some of the admissions stuff. And if there are questions about that, I'll be happy to answer. So let's start with the scoring. The SAT is at a 1600 and has been for many years now. A perfect ACT score is a 36. There are 4 sections which are average to get your composite score. And you can't score lower than a 2. So the lowest possible ACT score is an 8. Never seen that. And the highest possible score is a 36. We're going to dig into each one of these sections, which go in this order: English, math, reading, science. And remember that the ACT, like other standardized tests, is graded on a curve. That doesn't affect how we prepare or what we do, but what it means is you don't need to be perfect to get a perfect score. Sometimes you can miss a couple questions, but because of the curve, you may still get a perfect score or close to it. So here's the overall format. Let's just take a minute to soak this in. The first section of the ACT, so when the proctor says time starts now, you will open it to the English section, which is 5 15-question passages. And you get 9 minutes per passage, which is 45 minutes total, unless, of course, you have an extended time accommodation. It's pretty fast-paced, but I don't find that many students struggling for time on English, simply because a lot of the questions are very quick, just grammar rules that don't take too long or too much energy. Then math is definitely the beginning of this really fast-paced nature of this test: 60 questions and 60 minutes. They get harder as they go. We'll look a little bit more at that in about 10 minutes. Speaking of 10 minutes, that's the amount of break time you get between math and reading. And those last 2 sections are very, very fast-paced, so 35 minutes for 40 questions. And I think what I see most on ACT is students struggling for time, struggling to complete reading and science, or being very crunched for time at the end, so they have to rush. So math, reading, and science are all extraordinarily fast-paced. The offset is that the material is quite a bit easier than SAT. So it's just kind of simpler, more straightforward, overlapping content with SAT, but generally easier. So among these sections, what is the ACT testing? Again, it's about 80% overlap with the SAT. So we've got standard English conventions, so grammar rules. We've got high school math, which includes arithmetic, both algebra 1 and 2, a lot of that. Geometry, trig, and maybe a little bit of pre-calc at the end. I say about the ACT math that it's wanting you to know a little bit about a lot, versus the SAT wants you to know a lot about a little. Because SAT is a lot of algebra. Just if you know that stuff, you're pretty golden. For the ACT, they might ask you about a matrix or a logarithm or something in statistics that you may not know too much about or have barely seen. If you have even a cursory knowledge, though, of those topics, they'll usually give you the point, right? Hey, you ever heard of matrices? Here's a point. Do you remember linear equations? Here's another point. Do you remember vertex form? There's another. They're also going to test, of course, reading comprehension and to a lesser extent vocab. The vocab on ACT is not very advanced. And then the science section is all about graph reading and data interpretation. There's not much actual science. So you're going to see, especially on section 4, a whole lot of just interpreting y and x axes and how to read graphs. So before we get into each section individually, let's talk about some overall strategy. I've already had a question come up about how do I manage my time better? So the way to manage it is practice your pacing. So you sit down with anyone can do this, right? You've got a smartphone, you look at the stopwatch lap function. And so you start a passage and you hit start. And then every question you finish, you hit the lap button. So you know how long it took. Then when you're done, you can look back and say, oh, crud, I took 10.5 minutes when I needed to take 9 minutes. Which question did I take a longer time on? Then the next time you know, all right, I should skip this question because it takes me a long time, these types. Or maybe you study the one you missed and say, oh, I know what I did. I can get that more quickly next time. Practice makes perfect is a saying for a reason. But you can do time drills on your own or with a tutor. I do a lot of that with my students. First rule is just always make sure you're solving for the right thing. So like on math, what am I solving for? On English and reading, what is the question asking? Use your pencil, mark up the test booklet. We can still do active reading on this test. Second is keep it simple. Like on math, there's almost always a simple solution. So if you're starting to do like law of signs or quadratic formula on question 7, or like even anytime before number 40, there's probably something wrong. Maybe we can punch in answers or use a calculator. There's usually a simple way to solve. And finally, because there's no guessing penalty, don't leave any answers blank. That doesn't mean you have to go in order. So if you see a question and you're like, oh gosh, I missed this unit in geometry, it's been 3 years, don't spend 5 minutes trying to remember it, skip it, bubble in D or E or whatever, and just move past it. Prioritize easy points and get as many as you can. This is a hard thing for a lot of my students to embrace because a test, it's like, okay, well, I'm going into a test and I want to get a perfect score or close to it. The ACT is just not really an option. Most people don't even get to all the math problems, but you can get a very high ACT math score guessing on like 10 or 15 of the 60. We'll talk about strategic guessing and how to do that. I think that'll just be a little bit more in the math portion of today. All right, let's start with English. There are only about 12 or 13 English question types. Finite, right? Not too many to worry about. About 7 or 8 of them are grammar, and the rest are what we call rhetorical skills. And our strategy on a baseline level will differ between grammar and rhetoric. Notice the average time per question is 36 seconds, but some questions are going to be like 5 or 10 seconds once you practice and understand what they're getting at, and then others may take a minute, and we average it out. So if you need to skip around on some of the rhetoric questions that are longer, that's certainly an option. Here's an example of what a grammar question looks like. And this is indeed a pro tip. Using the answer choices on the front end of English is essential. So like when I see an English section, I start on the right side of the page where the answers are. And then I'll go back into the left side to read what I need to. But like right here, these answers tell us a lot. A, B, C, and D are all verbs. So I'm thinking, oh, it's verb tense. But then wait a second. Glide and glides, those are both present tense. So then we think, what is the difference between them? Well, the answer is it's singular plural. Glide is plural and glides is singular. When this happens, it's telling us a ton. So if you see glide versus glides in the answers, it's telling you this is very likely a subject-verb agreement question. I only know this from doing this for many years, but you can train yourself to be an expert and think like the test writers. The second thing it tells us is one of those answers is probably right. Almost always, we're going to see that the glide or glides is correct. And then usually they're trying to trick us by putting the subject way before the verb. In this case, the only thing that's slightly different is the third rule I put there. I think here the verb's actually before the subject. Either way, if we're down to A and C and thinking about it like that, we think, okay, who or what is gliding? Not the mountaintops, it's the eagle. The eagle is an it, not a they. Therefore, we say it glide? No, it glides. Our answer is C, over the mountaintops glides the great eagle. If you see is versus are or was versus were, those are other indicators that we're dealing with subject-verb agreement. So answer choices tell us really everything. Here are 3 more examples. So I'm going to leave this up for a moment and we'll talk through them together. Look at the right side and think about, okay, what are we testing here? Kind of talking through question 1. You can immediately notice they're testing punctuation, right? It's a semicolon, or it's a colon, or it's a comma, or it's nothing. The way I usually teach this is I would say, okay, what punctuation mark are you most comfortable with? And we may have to review it, but semicolons on this test are like periods. If a semicolon is the same as a period, that means it has to have a full sentence before and after, which in this case is not true. So no change can be correct. People don't like it, but it's right 1 out of 4 times, just like every other answer. But in this case, that semicolon is no good because it doesn't separate 2 full sentences. This is not a full sentence. So then I test C because it's no pause, and oftentimes that's the correct answer. Divers off the coast of Japan discovered a surprise on the seafloor, circular patterns made of sand. Should feel like we need a pause. And then between B and D, people really don't like using colons, but the rule for a colon is just it must follow an independent clause, meaning a full sentence, and it must introduce something. So in this case, before the colon, we've got a full sentence. Divers discovered a surprise on the seafloor. What we want to do is treat this colon as a drum roll, please. They discovered a surprise on the seafloor. Drum roll, please. What was that surprise? Circular patterns made of sand. D is our answer. I think colons often take a while to get used to. So okay if people don't feel amazing about that. And then for number 2, this is a pure comma question. So for this one, the general rule is we like fewer commas. We're going to test choice B first. Again, looking at answer choices first. B has no commas at all, which is often correct. These circles were often over 7 feet in diameter and contain concentric rings and ridges, making them appear much like a target or landing pad. Not terrible, but kind of a lot. So let's keep it for now. Look at C and D, which get the verb wrong. They were is past tense, so we need contained, not and containing, and not and contains. So no for C, no for D. And then we can just hone in on what's the difference between A and B, which is this comma. These circles were often over 7 feet in diameter and contain concentric rings and ridges, making them appear much like a target or landing pad. If you extend the pause and it doesn't sound terrible, the comma is probably correct. So that one's A, no change. And then the last one, because semicolons are periods, right away we're crossing out B and D. Wonderful test taking trick. Because they're functionally identical and we can't have 2 correct answers, So boom, they're both wrong. Then we look at A versus C, a dash versus a comma. One dash usually calls for a second dash, not including short-lived, that's just a compound word. So here, these divers were baffled by the discovery, and although these patterns are short-lived, as currents gradually erode them away, the circles would periodically reappear. It's a ton of commas, but C does work here. Practice makes perfect. You just got to see these and think, what are the test writers trying to get me to see? Identify question type, and then eliminate answers. That's really the trick for grammar questions on English. And within grammar, there's also like misplaced modifiers, pronouns. We saw verbs, possession. Then on the other end of the spectrum are these rhetoric questions. And they look totally different. As soon as you see there's not a no change answer, and you see, oh, this question is like actually has a question, right? At this point, the writer's considering adding, should they do it? So at this point, your mindset shifts. For grammar, we like short answers. It's got to sound good. For rhetorical skills, we don't care. We need an answer that stays on topic and transitions. If it stays on topic and it flows smoothly, it'll be good. And if not, it won't. So we don't have enough context on this question here. There's no passage. So we'd have to decide yes or no and then pick the rationale. Here's an example of that. This time, instead of looking at the answers, we look straight to the question. What do the writers want us to do? We need to pick a choice that provides specific information about her brother's hobbies. Then I'm looking at all the answers and thinking, okay, well, A is not that specific. B is pretty dang specific. And then C and D are okay, but pretty general. So in this case, even though it's the longest answer, we don't care. This isn't testing grammar rules. We just want the one robotically that provides specific info about her brother's hobbies. And B for sure, sorry, is the one to do that. Legos, Lincoln Log, those are specific hobbies. So for these, we're more like just, again, robotically accomplishing tasks. I find my bright students, which is really all of them, but especially bright students tend to overthink and pick something that they would write or that would sound good to them, which is probably good on grammar, but again, on rhetorical skills, your mindset should shift a little bit. So final tips on English before moving to math. Differentiate between grammar and rhetoric. If a question has a no change, it's probably grammar. If it has an actual question, then it's testing the rhetorical skills. For our grammar topics like punctuation and clauses and possession, we like short answers and you should trust your ear. Whereas for rhetorical skills, it's just, does this addition transition and does it stay on topic? On English, you want to treasure every question as if it's worth a point because it likely is. So you can miss like 4 out of 75 questions and get a 33 or 32 out of 36, just because the curve is so rough at the top. And if you find one topic that's tough, skip past it and do the other easy questions, coming back to that hard one or guessing on it. All right, let's talk math. This is something that I think is the biggest difference between SAT and ACT and arguably the hardest thing. There are 60 questions in 60 minutes. You don't get any formulas, but they do test geometry and trig kind of a lot. And you can get it, you can have a calculator throughout. There's no calc section. There are also 5 multiple choice answers instead of 4. This is only for math. So I don't know, that's just a little bit, makes it a little bit trickier. And again, it's knowing a little bit about a lot. So even on this page, you can see 40 through 42 has a question, like a word problem on logic. It has a geometry problem with area on a weird shape. And then it has an inequality question. And that's what you can expect. SAT hammers the algebra, ACT bounces everywhere. It goes from easier to harder. Of course, there's some overlap. So maybe question 25 like is easy or medium, but you haven't seen that topic ever before. So it's possible that question 55, which you just learned in pre-calc, will be easier. Depends on the person. But traditionally 1 through 20 easy, 21 through 40 medium, and then 41 through 60 hard. Which is why if we have to guess on like 10 questions, we want it probably to be at the very end. And the content is almost half algebra, so a ton of algebra stuff, lines and functions and all that. But then about a quarter of geometry, a quarter arithmetic, which are the hardest things, absolute value, inequalities, percentages, and just things you haven't thought of in forever. Luckily for those, you can often use the answer choices to your advantage. And they test a little bit of trig, so basic SOHCAHTOA and a few tougher things. It's hard to prepare for math though, because you just need to really brush up on a lot. And so if it's been 3 years since geometry, a lot of that is probably faded out of our brain and we need to refresh it. So a lot of work that I do with students is just, let's relearn this, or if you see it, let's kind of rework that muscle memory so you know what to do. Number one rule on math. What am I solving for? Then it's about what do I already know? So let's translate word problems, if they are wordy, into equations, into real math and numbers. Every math teacher ever has said this, but show your work. Use the test booklet, which you can write in, and there's a decent amount of space in the margins. So write it out, and then definitely use your calculator. There's no points awarded for mental math, so don't get lazy, just punch everything in. You can also use your graphing calculator to make decimals into fractions, or to do matrices or logarithms or graph things. So there are a lot of tools that people don't use to full advantage yet. And then this fourth one's a bit controversial because we don't really have time, but like, let's say you're solving for an angle measure and it looks like that. That's clearly more than 90. So if you pick 35, you can look and say, wait a second, I did something wrong. But to be honest, we don't have that much time to check our answer other than just quick, does it make sense? Look at some specific problems. These two would be right from the middle of the section, 29 and 30, which is usually where it starts to get kind of wild and a little bit unpredictable and sometimes tougher. So here alone, I mean, some students are going to be like, yeah, well, we just did a trig unit, so then we're fine on 29. Others are going to be like, oh, SOHCAHTOA, SOHCAHTOA. I remember that's a thing, but it's been so long. And then for 30, it's like, well, irrational number and then an absolute value, that's also something that people probably haven't done in school at all, or at least not for several years. So we think about how can we make these easy. For 29, I would say you got to memorize SOHCAHTOA. There aren't that many things to memorize for this test, but that's one of them. TOA being T, tangent is opposite over adjacent. So the tangent of angle A, little a, would be the opposite, that's big A, over the adjacent, which is big B. So for this one, opposite, adjacent, that's our answer. If they asked me for the sine of angle A, then it would have been A over C, because that's opposite over hypotenuse. And then for 30, right away, you could cross out some answers that aren't irrational. Irrational means that there's no fixed endpoint. So an imperfect square would be irrational. Pi is irrational. These are like the math vocab terms you have to brush up on. It's kind of annoying, but the ACT tests them. And then I'd probably honestly plug in the answers to see which one of these worked. All right, so just plug them in and see which one gets you a correct answer rather than trying to do tough math. Some people are attached to setting it up algebraically, and I have no problem with it as long as it's consistent and we don't make careless errors. We can come back to that question later if we have time, but let's look at this one first. So here, step one, what are we solving for? Another pro tip, if it's not a special right triangle, which we will talk about in a second, use the Pythagorean theorem. This actually is a special right triangle, but it's not one you need to memorize. Occasionally, if they say root 3 or root 2, those are the clues to look out for 30, 60, 90, and 45, 45, 90. But start with just basic Pythagoras. And this is something the SAT provides, the ACT does not. So a squared plus b squared is c squared is something pretty much all my students have learned at some point or another. The key here, though, is we're usually solving for c, the hypotenuse. This time we know it. So we'll do a squared, which is 24, or the unknown, plus b squared equals 26 squared. And then just punch it in the calculator. We'll end up with 576 plus b squared is 676. You subtract on both sides to get b squared is 100, which means b is 10. And again, this is a special right triangle, 5, 12, 13 multiple, but I feel like Pythagoras takes maybe 15 extra seconds and lets us memorize one fewer thing. So if that's at all challenging to keep in your brain, don't worry about it and just do this with Pythagorean theorem. Here's another example, this one testing probability. For this question, again, what are we solving for? Which is how many additional cashews must be added? So the probability of randomly drawing a cashew is 2 out of 5. I think this pro tip is actually pretty advanced, but unless we're going to use the answers and really carefully plug in to the numerator and denominator, which people will mess up usually, don't focus on the cashews because that's what's changing. Macadamias and peanuts aren't. So if we know we need the cashews to be 2/5, that means our final probability of the other nuts, macadamias and peanuts, has to be 3 out of 5. So we have to translate because ACT often has these word problems with kind of strange scenarios. 18 plus 9 is 27 macadamias and peanuts. So we know that that final number will be 27. We're not adding those. That means 27 over our final total will be 3 out of 5, the remaining fraction. I think a lot of people will have a challenge setting out that proportion. It's pretty confusing. Once we do it, then we still need to remember, oh, this is when we cross multiply. When you've got a fraction equaling a fraction, you cross multiply, so 3x, the equal sign stays in the middle, and then equals 135, and we solve. And so we get 45, which would often be an answer choice, but is not correct. Because what that told us is we need 45 nuts total. So then let's just think, okay, how many do we have to add? So we subtract the 27 macadamias and peanuts, and then we subtract the 13 cashews and see we needed 5 more. This is number 31, but again, it's a question a lot of people would probably choose to skip because it's wordy and takes a while. And if you're thinking, okay, I think I almost get it, but not quite, that's okay. It's hard to get this on one go, right? So practice questions like it a few more times, and then you'll be okay. Before we move into reading, let's talk final tips and tricks. So I said show your work. I really think that's intensely important, and maybe even more important is use your calculator, right? So don't just guess or do mental math. Jump around if needed, prioritize easier questions, which are usually earlier. It is totally okay not to get to every question. A vast majority of students taking the ACT do not. But don't leave anything blank. And my recommendation is bubble in the last answer choice, which is E or K, straight down the line. So like a really good math student could get to just the first 45 questions. And the goal would be let's nail those 45, but then 2 minutes left, we don't have time to do the last 15. So what you do is you guess like straight down the line. Don't Christmas tree it and go like A, B, A, C, whatever. Go straight down the line, and I choose the last answer because I feel like it's more often correct at the end. The idea behind that is if you Christmas tree it and just guess, you're going to miss them all probably. If you go straight down the line, you're at least going to get a few, and that can add really precious points to our score. As far as, by the way, which calculators to use, the SAT has a drop-down Desmos calculator. The ACT doesn't because it's on paper. but a TI 83, TI 84, TI 89, even a TI Inspire, amazingly, is legal. It can't have the CAS at the end. It can't be a computer, basically. And yes, if we have time, we'll come back and look at some of these math problems. Review basic geometry and trig rules. I do think that's a good idea. So of the things we need to memorize, they're mostly geometry and trig. And then also basic stats. What's a mean, what's a median, what's a mode. Draw the shapes out. So proportional shapes or circles or triangles, draw them if they didn't do it for you. And maybe most important is if you do get stuck, realize before you skip, maybe I can plug in the answers, or maybe I can use my own numbers. Those are really tried and true strategies for getting stuck, and skipping is an option, but try those first. All right, let's talk reading. "40 questions, which is 4 passages of 10 questions each. 35 minutes total. So that's a big time crunch. You get less than 9 minutes per passage. So if we are going to get to everything, which of course is the goal, you'll be taking 8 minutes and 45 seconds to read a passage and do 10 questions. Then we have to acknowledge that, like some students, we don't have extended time, but we're not getting to everything. And if I try to do all 4 passages, I'm just like 2 of them are awful because I'm rushed. So maybe your strategy, and we talk through it with a tutor or whoever you're working with, and think, well, let me just try to get to 3 passages. And I'll just guess D as in dog for the other 10 questions. Your ceiling is lower, but your floor is probably higher, because if you dedicate yourself to 3 passages, it's probably better than spreading yourself thin across 4. And if our score on reading is a little bit lower and like we feel like, geez, I'm really not getting to anything, I'm totally lost, pick the 2 passages you're most comfortable with, nail those as best you can, and guess on the other 20. You'd be surprised how well people can score doing these strategies. It's uncomfortable. People don't like skipping questions or not getting to everything, but it is honestly a test taking strategy most people need on ACT. Here are the genres, always in this order. So first is prose fiction, which would be literary narrative. A lot of people don't love this because it could be like 1800 something in old school English, but it will never be as complex as SAT Lit. Second passage is always social sciences, so it'll be more fact-based. Third is humanities, which is a little bit more like passage 1, and then fourth is natural sciences. You don't have to go in this order. Some people really like the fact-based ones, so they do passage 2 and 4, and then the others. But just practice, think about where you're comfortable. Maybe skip a passage and do it last, or skip a couple question types here and there. But I do think this will always be the case of this is the order they come in. And as far as strategies, like it is an open book test. You're going to read a passage and you get these questions. The ACT, even though it's fast paced, generally has simple questions, simple answers that match perfectly. For example, here, the question is, which is a capability of the Kepler? If we've done our job really well, we've actively read the passage, we've made notes on the margin, we've underlined, we've circled, we've starred things, but especially little notes. So we can go back and find where this was, and then boom, line 65 to 66 matches F perfectly. There are no bad words, right? There's nothing that makes F wrong, so we can feel comfortable picking it. I think the hard part is doing that in a short amount of time while evaluating the other choices, right? That's the big challenge on reading in science. So some questions people often will see, structure questions. So like the first question of a passage might be either what's the main purpose or how's it structured. Once in a while they ask you about point of view. So who's the narrator? Sometimes the blurb above the passage will help. Main idea of a paragraph. Vocab, which would be as used in line 27, the word blank most nearly means what. And so I think looking at each question type and thinking, okay, these are the ones I really like, these ones take me forever, right? That alone is knowledge and power. And then of the 4 passages, and we never know which it will be, Of the four, one of the passages will be what's called a comparison. So you'll see like humanities, passage 3, and then it'll be like, oops, passage A and passage B. To keep a smaller amount of material in your working memory, read passage A and then do those first few questions, and only then should you read passage B. So it's a very slight difference, but find the comparison passage on test day and just know, oh, let me do A and the A questions and then B and the rest. So the tips and tricks I would give you on reading. Active reading, again, is opposite of passive reading. So people often will start pencil in hand, but then we get to, like this, right? And then this, and then maybe that, and then that's passive reading. And it's not going to result in a good score usually. Instead, pencil at the ready. I'm not huge on circling or starring things. I underline to keep awake, but for me, the main thing you can do is summarize it in your own words. If you can make an outline for yourself in the margins, that'll help you a ton on the questions. I think that's especially important on the sciencey passages 2 and 4. You do not have to do those in order. You can skip questions and or passages. You always want to use elimination. So not what is the right answer, but what is the least wrong. And then sparrow versus peacock. So peacock answers are flashy. They're specific, right? Every scientist will agree with this. Every is kind of like I don't know about that. Sparrow answers would be some scientists may agree. Says basically nothing. Those are good reading answers. We like vague. Only pick a specific answer if it matches completely perfectly. So we like vague general answers on reading rather than flashy. And then think like a test writer. What did they put into these wrong answers to make them wrong? Right. So that's the other way you can game the system a bit. All right, definitely going to leave some time for questions. So we've got about 20 minutes or so. Let's spend 5 of those on the science section. This does give a lot of people trouble initially, but then when they get to know it, it's a bit easier. The key is understanding that you don't need to know that much science to do almost any of these questions. It's another 40 questions, 35 minutes. There are 6 passages. Each of them will have 6 or 7 questions apiece. And again, it's not actual science, right? Very rarely they will mention stuff like for sure you'll see stuff that you learn in physics or chemistry or bio, but you very rarely need to actually know anything about it. Just matching graphs. It's a lot more just about common sense and basic science. And sometimes it's advanced, but we don't need to deeply understand it. So how can we demystify the science section? Number one is don't call it science, call it graphs, but stay on the surface, right? On 5 of the 6 passage types, we will actually skip straight to the graphs. A lot of the information is completely unnecessary. So we just go question, choices, graphs. And so I would say look at the questions and the answers, and then match those words in the question and answers to the graphs. If there's no match, you might have to work harder or look for context, but I would say at least 60% of the time, that'll be all you need to do is just find it in the graph. Again, 5 of the 6 passages are normal, so you'll see stuff like this. You'll get a couple studies, you'll see tables, and then questions about them. I don't know anything about sand, silt, and clay and particle content. Literally nothing. But I have these things in the table. I can say, oh, well, it looks like as water content rises, or clay, like all these things, sand's the only one that looks like it's an inverse relationship. And they'll ask you like something like, as water content percent increases, what happens to the particle content of sand? And then we'd know. Here's another table you could see. Dirt, clouds, right? And again, here I can see the relationship is this is going up, and so is this. So that's a direct relationship between cover of low clouds and whatever the hell cosmic ray flux is. Right? Some people are going to be attached to, man, I learned about this. I should know this. We don't need that almost ever. So how do we read graphs? We look for trends like we just did. X and Y axis and the key are going to be essential. Read the title of the graph. Think about what can you extrapolate given a certain trend. And then on the harder questions, we might need to use scientific method, like what was the control or what was the independent or dependent variable, and things you probably have done in science class. But those common sense questions are a little bit more rare than your graph matching. Here's a practice question. Spend 30 seconds or so looking here at what they're asking and where this point would be. If you understand the question, this one's going to be no sweat. At which temperature, that's the x-axis, would the luminosity, I don't see that anywhere, of a star in galaxy B be close to 2 times the luminosity of a star in galaxy B with a surface temperature of 3000? All right, so the first thing here is I don't know what luminosity is. So on the test, I go back to the passage where they probably tell me RL is relative luminosity. So this is luminosity. And so let's look at galaxy B at 3000. That would be at 1. And they're saying, let's compare that. Like, when would it be 2 times that? Which looks like it's like maybe right here. Draw the line down. That's at a surface temperature of 3300. So our answer would be G for this one. That's just finding a point. And in the context of a bunch of other questions, people will think, I don't see any questions that easy, but I guarantee you that they're there. So that's just finding a point in the graph. Here's a relationships question. Go ahead and try this one. So here we're looking at as surface temperature, which is the x-axis, increases, the size, which is the y-axis, and it looks like it's not a constant rate, but it never goes down. It never plateaus. This one's B. Increases only, direct relationship. Final tips for science is, of the 6 passages, again, one is different. It's more like a reading passage. It's called Dueling Scientists, and what you'll notice is Scientist 1, Scientist 2, Scientist 3 with opinions. You can choose to do that first. If you're like motivated from reading and want to do one more reading passage, you do that. Or if you want to save it for last, that's an option too. Or do it in order, but just know you treat it differently. Because for the other passages, we're going to go straight to the question and choices. We're going to match the graphs. If there is no match, look to the passage for context. And then in the rare occasion there's still no match, use common sense and think like a 10th grade scientist, not a rocket scientist. So demystified. Last little bit I want to talk about is just how this kind of works into college apps and admissions, and then we'll leave some time for questions. The SAT no longer has an essay portion. The ACT has one technically. It is optional. No, like the only schools that required it as of 2 years ago were these ones, which frankly, besides West Point, I had never heard of. But if these are on your list, then if you're taking ACT, we do need to do the essay still. But for a vast majority of folks, I can say, hey, don't worry about the essay portion. There are some like Ivies and competitive schools that recommend it, but I think the ACT essay is silly. Most admissions offices are looking at personal statements. So some questions that maybe we'll knock out are when should I begin preparing? Towards the end of junior year is pretty good time. So like the problem is then if you're starting now and you've got APs in May, it might be tough. So some choose then to wait until summer. There's no real like right or wrong time, right? And even if you're thinking, oh, geez, I'm late, it's not too late. You've got plenty more cracks at these tests. The ACT is given in February, April, June, July, September, October, December. I get the question from parents and students, what is a good score? It's an impossible question to answer. Depends on what your goals are, where you started, and how hard you're willing to work, because this is a test of effort, not intelligence. And then should I send all my test results? So when applying to schools, the ACT automatically super scores. What that means is if you take multiple tests across different test dates, if you score super low on English and high on science, and the next time you flip that and the higher English score results but lower science, colleges which super score, which is about half, will only see your high English and high science. So they won't even know that you took the test twice. They'll see your super score, meaning highest test scores from multiple sittings. So that's a case-by-case basis and decide, well, some schools are test optional. You may not send it at all. Just think about what their policies are. When deciding whether to send a score, you can just Google like the college, like Kennesaw State, and say, okay, what's their ACT range? Right? So like this would be their 25th to 75th percentile. So that means most of the people who get in are in the 21 to 24 ACT range. So if I scored a 23, I'm thinking, well, that's on the high end of that range. I'll probably submit that score. If it was an SAT, I would not be sure. I might want to take it again. I'm like, oh, that's in the range, but it's on the lower half, so I wouldn't feel as comfortable. Right? So looking at where their ranges are, where your scores are, that can help you make an informed decision. How many times should we test? I mean, I feel that it takes most students 3 official tests to reach full potential, but at least 2. It's too much pressure to say I'm going to take the ACT in April and that's it. No matter who you are, I think it's better to have some backup options and say, well, I hope I get the score I want, but I've got more cracks at it in June and July. And there's no wrong time to test, right? Think about your extracurricular schedule and just what you've got going on and test at a time that's a little bit more relaxed. I often get the question of, do colleges prefer SAT versus ACT? The answer is no. So don't let that factor into your decision. You should take a baseline of both tests and then pick which one you're better at or that you like more. And again, I'll just emphasize, this is not a test of intelligence. People say generally there are 8 types of intelligence, and the only 2 that the SAT arguably tests would be mathematical, logical, and verbal intelligence. But even there, if you understand what the test writers are doing, you put the effort in on your own or in a group or with a tutor or with peers, you can raise your score a ton, right? It's just a matter of effort and then how well you perform running into the right test on the right day. If you're interested in test prep, which is again what I do, I work from my home in Colorado and I do online tutoring for ACT, SAT all day, every day. Reach out to Appleruth. You can request different levels of tutors. You can request to work with me directly, even if I can fit you into my schedule, I will. Appleruth also offers academic support. So that's for a student if they just need a little bit of support in calculus or a certain class. We have plenty of tutors who do that. Test prep extends to AP exams, which we've got a lot of stuff going on these days because that's coming up. And then executive function coaching, which is helping students be more organized, structured, and thinking about the way they think, metacognition. All right, we have successfully left some time for questions, and I see some good ones, so let's do it. The first question is kind of a broad one, which is how can I manage my time better? And so I addressed it a little bit. I think the big key is you got to break up sections and do timing drills on your own. So like what I would do is think, I get 9 minutes per English passage. Sit down and do an English passage. If you're under 9 minutes and doing well, great. If not, think about where you're losing time, right? So it's really, that's what I mean by effort. Figure out where you're losing time and help yourself fix those mistakes. The next question is about accommodations. So like, let's say we have a learning difference. We have dyslexia or ADHD or processing delay. If you have accommodations and you have a 504 plan or IEP in school, you should apply for accommodations on the official test and make sure that you have those. If you do have accommodations, like for time and a half on the official ACT, then when you take the practice ACT, you should also do it with time and a half. And yes, there is an option for a practice test to do it with extended time. So if you get extended time in school, you're very likely to get it granted on ACT. And so you're going to want to practice with the time and a half, which is a blessing and a curse because we need that time, but then you're there for 5 hours, right? So like if we have ADHD and lack of focus is challenging, that can be really hard. So we got to think about how do we manage break time and let our brain rest. TI 84 plus CE is allowed in the math section, certainly. Yep, that one's totally fine. And it can do everything for you. So yeah, TI 84 plus is a good one to bring. How much is extended time? So if you do have accommodations, the most common extended time granted is time and a half, meaning if it was 60 minutes, you'll get 90. Some people have other accommodations. Double time is the other one that I've seen, but it's usually time and a half is by far the most common. This test, oh, good question. Is this test on paper or online? ACT is still on paper, right? They've piloted out some digital ACTs, but they have not made it work. The SAT is now only on a computer. The ACT is still a paper test. So you got your Scantron, you're bubbling in, test booklet to take notes in. Yeah, it's old school stuff. Does the ACT essay count towards the total score? No, it never did. And now, especially since it's so irrelevant, it definitely doesn't count, but it was always separate from the 36. What would a 36 ACT be as an SAT score? That would be a perfect 1600. And there are concordance tables. I want to say Applewood has one, but also like Naviance. You can type in an ACT score and see what that would be equivalent to on SAT. And as far as accommodations on the practice test, there should be no need to apply. It's just when you register for a test, there should be an option to register for one that's regular time or one that's extended time. If you have any issues at all with that, email the email below or call the number and they can help. Okay, next question is about science. What are most of the science questions going to be based on? So we'll be like earth science, chemistry, mixed bag. I see biology sometimes where like you've got to think a little bit about alleles and dominant recessive and Punnett squares. And then all of a sudden it'll be about quarks or something in physics. And then like photosynthesis and chemistry. So I think everything, but don't think of it as what topics. Instead, think what are the graphs and how do I interpret them? Right? The science itself barely ever matters. And if you overthink on that, it's usually going to actually do more harm than good. How long after the ACT practice test do you receive your score? It's almost always within the week. It's usually just a few days. If you are curious about what it was, what you should do when you're done is take a picture of your bubbled in Scantron. I guess it'd be 2 pictures. And then you can actually enter them online yourself in the on the Applewood page. So I do that for students a lot. If they're not wanting to wait a few days for the results to come back, we just take our picture of the bubbled in sheet when done. We can just enter it into the system. It'll generate a full score report. Is it a bad idea to take the ACT as a sophomore? No, I think that it's early, but especially if you've already done some practice, I don't think it's a terrible idea. The hard part of that might be that there's probably some math that will be beyond you unless you're in like a super accelerated track. But if you haven't taken Algebra 2, all these tests are pretty tough. And ACT does some trig and pre-calc as well. So the math would be my only hesitation about taking the ACT as a sophomore. And if you're a high scorer, you should probably be working on PSAT and SAT in the interest of national merit. I read that you should take around 5 months to prepare, but do you think 2 months is enough? Depends on the person. 2 months for one test is probably about right, but then I wouldn't expect to be done then. I would expect another month or two and take another test at least. But if you're working hard, if you're working for an hour every day and finding questions you're missing and fixing them, oh, you could do it in 2 months, but it takes a very self-motivated person. Next is, do you know where we could find practice tests? So Applewood has a really great book that has 2 tests in the back of it. And it's, even if you don't enroll in tutoring, it's relatively inexpensive. You can buy the book a la carte. or if you get into a tutoring program, you'll get that book. The other source for practice tests, and these are the ones that we send out as mocks, would be the official ACT prep guide. It's a big red book, and it has like, I think 9 tests from the past 5 years. Those would be your best bet. There's also one or two free ones online, 1874 FPRE and 2176 CPRE are free ACTs online. Practice test online or in person, unless you are in Atlanta or one of the places we have offices and you registered for an in-person test, I'm assuming the practice test is online and you should get an email link about that. But if you have any issues, just email info@appleruth. All right, just got a couple more little questions here, and then we will wrap up. And of course, if you feel like you've gotten what you need, thank you for joining. All right, one unanswerable question, which is what scores are good on the ACT? And what I mentioned is it just depends, right? What are your goals for colleges? What's your starting score? A good score is an improvement from where you began, but I can't say that like what is good and what is not. I think a 20 out of 36, 20 or 21 would be 50th percentile nationally. But a lot of my students are aiming for a 30 or above. So again, just depends on the person. If we're talking Ivy League schools, then you need to be near perfect if you are going to submit a score, right? Some Ivies are still test optional, but if we are submitting an ACT score to an Ivy League school, we're probably only doing it if it's between a 34 and 36, which is kind of crazy, but that's just how competitive it is. Other than math, do you think for the other subjects we should focus more on time management, like taking small side notes and underlining type answers in your head so it can be nice and quick? I couldn't have said it better myself. Like on reading and science, practice that, not annotating, but taking simple notes to save yourself energy. And then when you get to the questions, everything's there in the margins in your own words. So yeah, I do think time management is important throughout. Last question. If I'm taking an ACT in 2 weeks in school, how should I best prepare in this time? What I would do is I would take a practice test. I would look at the couple of sections, so like maybe it's English and math that were the lowest, and I would target maybe just those. You don't have time to do everything, but I think that's what I would do is take that practice test, and then you just need resources, right? So again, I'm biased, but the Appleruth book is very, very good. You could look up a tutor, right? And contact Appleruth, get a tutor, and meet a couple sessions. Yeah, I think it's tough to do in 2 weeks. Don't cram, but you can get a baseline knowledge. Thank you so much for joining. I do think most colleges will still be test optional, but some schools like Dartmouth are now coming back to test required. And you register for the official ACT on act.org, costs like $50, but that's separate from practice tests. All right, got a lot of info. Thank you so much for joining. Have a wonderful night, and I appreciate it.